Well, Democrats' elitist attitudes about education could cost them more than just midterms, according to journalist and friend of the show, Matt Taibbi. In his latest piece, Taibbi argues that you can sell voters on a lot of policies, but we know how to raise your children better than you will never be one of them.
We all remember Virginia's gubernatorial race that turned out to be a major upset for Dems after Glenn Youngkin trumped Terry McAuliffe. The outcome of that race should have been a blatant warning to Democrats, but it doesn't look like MSNBC got the memo.
You know, parents want to have look, a Virginia governor's race was arguably decided on the strength of how influential should parents be on curriculum. How do we do this?
Well, I would say the governor's race in Virginia was decided based on the success of a right-wing propaganda campaign that told white parents that they needed to fight against their children being indoctrinated as being called racist. But that was a propaganda campaign. And there are a lot of Black parents in Virginia. There are a lot of Latino parents in Virginia, and they were not being featured in that coverage. And what they wanted for their kids' education, which is more teaching about race, more teaching about the history of racism, seem to have fallen on deaf ears. So I think we should frame that question properly. And I don't really understand this idea that parents should decide what's being taught.
Journalist and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast, Matt Taibbi, joins us now to expand on this. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Robbie.
Yeah, I've been loving your pieces, your dispatches from Loudoun County. Talk to us a little bit more about what you heard from the parents you talked to. Is Nicole Hannah-Jones' experience, which I talked about on my radar earlier this week, she's saying that, this was made up. This was just some white people who are being spotlighted. This isn't what Black and Latino parents want. My understanding is that there are a lot of Latino parents and probably a lot of Black parents as well that I've interacted with that are also concerned about what's going on in these schools. But what do you think?
Yeah, there are so many ironies to that interview that she just gave there. I went down to Virginia not really having any idea of what the controversy was actually about. All I had done is read the national news coverage. So I was expecting to find a story about parents who were outraged about things like teaching about slavery or promoting racial justice. And as is often the case in journalism, when you actually start digging, it turns out to be like a far weirder and more idiosyncratic story under the surface. What happened in Loudoun really began with an argument about gifted admissions. And this all stems from the fact that there's a major statistical inequity there that has to do with the fact that an influx of mostly South Asian immigrants, these are sort of Indian immigrants from the south of India who came in the 90s and the early 2000s, and their kids are dominating the gifted admissions programs. They're 70% of the admissions programs, despite being only 20% of the student body. And this led to a complaint by the NAACP that there was systemic racism in the county. And that led to an AG's settlement that forced them to change their policies to a more randomized system. And it had very little to do with what was being taught. It was all about this other thing. And the irony of that is that the group that got primarily disenfranchised in the end were non-white. The parents who I started talking to first were these South Asian immigrant parents. These are, they tended to be not terribly wealthy people who came here having experienced discrimination back in India, where they are, where there's discrimination because they have darker skin. And now they come to the United States and they find themselves described as white supremacists. It's almost too absurd to write about it. I didn't even know how to describe it.
I think we Asians are used to at this point now being described as white supremacists. I mean, it seems to be like a common trend. Even Andrew Yang was considered potentially, somehow a racist or a white supremacist. One thing that you mentioned in your piece, Matt, is that McAuliffe, it was seen as a gaffe, right? Like the media sort of painted it as a gaffe when he said this, but you kind of equated it to Hillary Clinton's gaffe, and how it wasn't actually really a gaffe at all. So
right.
Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, and this is a fascinating feature of sort of how modern media works. So when Hillary Clinton said that thing about the basket of deplorables, you might remember there was this flood of editorials that came out in the ensuing days about how this was a political unforced error. The word gaffe was used constantly, and usually what pundits were saying is even if that's true, you can't say that. You can't offend voters in that sort of broad way. Well, what ended up happening was within a couple of months, especially after Trump got elected, the formula was no longer that some part of Trump's electorate was deplorable. It was that they were all deplorable. And then they kept escalating the rhetoric. They went from being racist to being white supremacist to being, terrorists now and that sort of thing. And this is what's going on in Loudoun. It's a very similar phenomenon where they started off by saying, well, we don't think parents should decide what gets taught in schools. And then that's described as a mistake. But actually, when you drill down into what they really believe, they actually think that. It wasn't a slip of the tongue.
Yeah, so Glenn Youngkin has said that mask mandates in schools and virtual learning will not return in Virginia. But I just saw on Twitter, D.C.'s mayor, Muriel Bowser, said, well, yeah, of course we have to bring back virtual learning. What are you kidding? So I don't have kids, but if I did, I guess I would have to move across the river. And there's no part of me that would rather live under Republicans than under Democrats. I have no affection for either party. But if I had kids, I would I would want them to go to school. I would have to raise them in a Republican environment. Isn't the reality of that just a terrible political strategy for Democrats to commit to?
Yeah, absolutely. Democrats have historically enjoyed an enormous polling advantage on the education issue. It's gotten as high as 30 points. In the Obama years, I saw 29, 30 points in some surveys. It's down to the single digits now. And what you brought up is a really interesting point, because if you read all the coverage, the national coverage of Loudoun, you probably didn't hear about school closures being a big deal, but they were the primary issue for most people there. It was the fact that the school board was very, very slow in reopening schools, and what compounded the issue is that these parents were getting to see up close what their kids were and were not learning, and they were realizing, well, there's a reason why my 4th or 5th grader doesn't know how to do long division, because they're not teaching them anything. It's not that they're teaching them, sort of woke stuff in school, and that's what they're getting upset about. The more common complaint was, my kids are not learning anything. They need to be in school being taught something, and they're not even in school. Forget about CRT. That's the problem.
Yeah, and the schools are saying, right? They're saying you are trying to claim too much power over this process. We're sick of your input. We don't want you to have very much to do with it. But are also saying, and by the way, you're going to be solely responsible for watching and educating these kids whenever we feel like it. That's obvious. That would make even the most partisan Democrat furious to have to deal with that contradiction, I would think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. I don't mean to interrupt, but just quickly, there are so many people I talk to. Well, I mean, a significant number of people I talk to who I would say lean Democrat, at least. These were not hardcore Republicans, right? And what happened to them politically during the school closures, they went through a transformation. The attitude of the school board was so contrary to what they were thinking and feeling, and they felt like they were just being completely ignored, and that is enraging for parents. Parents, that's one of those things that you just can't mess with. There's a lot of issues that you can take positions on, but when it involves kids, people get very emotional.
Yeah, I think this is just another one of those examples of the Democratic Party just completely missing the point. I mean, we saw this with Hillary Clinton and Trump winning, and it was look, you just overlooked the Rust Belt in America. You overlooked these white working class people who are not able to live the American dream anymore. And instead of focusing on that and focusing on the economics and building the middle class, Democrats just turned it all into racism. And they're doing it again with this, rather than listening to the parents and the parents saying, look, it was the lockdowns that bother us, right? They're saying, oh, no, you're just a racist. You're just mad about critical race theory. And that's your problem. And that's what the media blows up. Like you said, we don't even hear about the fact that it was really more about the lockdowns and these parents being stuck, not knowing what to do with their kids, not fully understanding how best to educate them, especially if they have multiple kids at home. And, but that gets overlooked. And it's just, no, you're all just a bunch of racists. That's the real problem here in America.
Yeah, and that was just such a crowning insult for this particular group of people, because, I think there are legitimate differences of opinion about how to pursue school policy. There's no way to make every demographic happy in any school district. It's like school administrators and school boards have, I think, an impossible job. And so there are problems in the school district. There are inequities in the application of discipline. There are inequities in gifted admissions. The grades, inequities in grades. Well, how do we solve those problems? Well, we have to come together and do that. But rather than invite everybody to the table and say, you all have a stake in this, we understand, you all love your kids, you all want the same things for your kids. Instead, there was this media campaign that was just basically designed to say anybody who opposes us is a racist and closed-minded and a bigot and unfit and all these other things. And I just can't even express to you the level of vitriol and anger that you would see from people who you just wouldn't expect. This is the richest county in America. They have a lot to be happy about in Loudoun County, right? They live in a beautiful place. They're not going to starve to death. But there is real rage in this place, and it's, as you said, it's an unforced error. They didn't need to make it this way.
Yeah.
Well, Matt Taibbi, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.